guys, welcome back to this series. In this video we're going to talk about state in React.js, and we're going to see how to manage component data dynamically using state. We're also going to see how to update our state efficiently and avoid common mistakes like re-rendering and all of that. So now, what is state? State is like a variable that React components keep track of, but unlike regular variables, when state changes, the components re-render to reflect the new data. So what are the key points? The key points here is that state stores data inside our component, and we also say React provides useState to manage state inside function components. And lastly, we are saying every state needs an initial value. So back to our code editor, we are going to create a simple counter app where clicking a button increases a count in a state. So when we click a button, we're going to increase the count of the button click. This will help us explain state better and explain how to update state in our React application. So moving over to our app.js, we're going to take out all the components we created in our last video, and we'll continue from here. So we're going to see how to create state in our application. How do we create state? We create state by saying const. We use the square bracket to say count, and we have the set count. The second value is the set count, which of course we said every state must have an initial value, so we're going to use an initial value of 0. Remember, see what we did here? We imported our useState from React. So let's also have React here. So our initial count value is 0, and if we come over here to say h1, of course, remember how to use your JavaScript in your JSX, and we're counting count. If I save this and I go back to our browser, you're going to see the count displayed, which is the initial value. So this is what we have 0 as our initial value, right? If I go back to our editor and I change the initial value to 10, if I save this, we'll go back to see our initial value to 10. So this is basically how to create our state in our React. The first value is the state, the value of the state, and the second data here is the setter of the state. This helps us to update the value of the state. So we said we're going to create a counter app. We're going to see how we can update the value of the state. So we're going to do that by creating a button component. We're going to say a button component, and this button is just going to say increase. If I save this and I go back, I'm going to have a button say increase, and I'm going to create a new button, a different button that will say decrease. So we have two buttons, one is supposed to increase and one is supposed to decrease, but if we click on this button, nothing happens. So let's first of all inspect this. Let's inspect this, go to our console, and we're going to add on-click event. We're going to talk about events in the next video. We're going to have on-click events, and this on-click event is supposed to change the value of our count, right? It's supposed to change the value of our count, and we're saying when I click on this button, set my count. My set count is actually a setter that helps to update the value of my state. And what am I saying? I'm saying whatever is the value of my state, add 1 to it. Whatever is the value of my state, add 1 to it. And in the next button, I'm doing the same thing, but in this case, I'm saying whatever is the value of my state, remove 1 from it. So what this is supposed to do for us is when I click on the increase, the initial value, of course, we're reducing the initial value to 0. When I click on increase, the action is going to take the initial value of the count, which is 0. So I'm going to have 0 plus 1, which is 1. The 1 will be saved in our state. So the state of our the value of our state will change to 1. If I click on the button again, we're going to have 1 plus 1, which is 2. 2 will be saved in our state. If I click on it again, the initial value of the state will now be 2, and it will be 2 plus 1, which is 3. So that is how to increase the value of our state. And if I do the same thing here, whatever the value is, I will remove 1 from it and I will save it back to the state. So having all of that, this is what we have in our editor, and we have this. But then let's demonstrate something. Okay, let's just proceed, right? That is not necessary. If I click on increase, you're going to see the value of my application, of my state, increases to 1. So what we have here is will now become 1 as the initial value. If I click on it again, we're going to have 1 plus 1, which is 2, which is exactly what we're going to have here. And if I click on decrease, I'm updating this value of my state and I'm removing 1 from it. If I do it again, I'm having 0. If I click on it again, I'm going to have -1, because 0 minus 1 is -2, minus 1 minus 1 minus -1 minus 1 is -2, right? So this is how to change the values, increase or decrease the value of your state using a button. So if you paid attention to this, you will understand that immediately the state changes, the component will re-render. So we don't need to update, we don't need to refresh our web page to see the changes. Once the state of our application changes, the components will re-render to have the new value of our state. So there are common mistakes people make in handling states. We're going to look at those common mistakes, and one of those common mistakes is making sure you're updating your state correctly. Most persons make the mistake of modifying states directly instead of using the setter function. Remember I said this is the setter function, the set component is the setter function, which helps us to update the value of our state. You cannot update the value of your state without using the setter function. How do we mean? So I'm going to demonstrate how to do this wrongly. So we cannot say in our increase function, we cannot say on click count, we cannot say on click count equal to count plus 1. This is wrong. We cannot do this. We cannot update the value of our state correctly, because this basically will not work. We can't update the value of our state without use the setter function. The best thing to do is what we did before, using the setter function to update the state of the value of our state. So this is basically wrong way, and this is the correct way to set our value. So take note guys, never modify state directly, always use the set state or the setter function. So now we're going to look at managing complex states. We're going to see how we can use state with objects and array. State is not just limited to numbers or strings, right? We can also use it to update objects and arrays. For example, we can create a state of user object, and we're going to change it to set user object. And what is the user object? Remember how object looks like. I can have a name property, which is Paul. I can have the age property, which is let's say which is 10, and I can have the gender property, which is male, right? Our state can also save objects, not just integers or string. So how do we use this? Remember this was for increase and decrease. So we can now say user object dot name. Remember we talked about the structuring props, right? And we saw how to use this, and this we're actually using this to render our objects. First of all, let me demonstrate something for us. If we go over to say console.log user object, if I save this and I go back, when I try to inspect this, we're going to see the user object here. We're going to see the age, the gender, and the name, which means the user object state is holding an object. And before we can have access to the values of the object, we must reference the property we want to have access to. So that brings us to what we were doing initially, which is this user object.name, because the user object has a property called name. So we can always only have access to the value of the property by referencing the property itself. So I'm saying user object.name. If I save this, this is going to display Paul in our screen, right? This is going to display Paul in our screen. If I change this to age, this is going to display the age of Paul. And if I change this to gender, this is going to display the gender of Paul. So this is how to use objects in our state and how to display them in our JSX. So now what happens if I want to update the age of Paul when I click a button, right? We saw how to update a state with an integer using a button. So how do I update this object? I update the age of Paul when I click a button. So I'm going to create a button component, which I'm going to say add age, right? In this button component, I'm going to create, of course, on click event. The on click event is going to have an arrow function, which is going to say set user object, right? Set user object. I'm using the spread operator. Please pay attention to this. I'm using a spread operator to copy the existing state while updating only the age. So I'm saying copy everything in the user object. The user object is actually what we have here. Copy everything in the user object, but when it gets to age, I want you to update the age to something else. So what is it? I want you to add 1 to the age we already have. When it gets to age, get the value of the initial age, which is age user object.age, and add 1 to it, right? Let me take that again. I'm copying all the data of the state, all the existing state, right? But when it gets to age, I want you to get the initial value of the age and add 1 to it, right? If I save this and I go back to my editor and I say, right, so here we're going to render the age. Age is 10. If I click on 1, age becomes 11. If I click on it, age becomes 12. But then look at this. If I say copy everything in the state and when it gets to age, let the age be 1. This is a different logic. If I click on this, age becomes 1. Right? I am no longer doing increment. I'm no longer doing increment. This will do the increment and the other will only assign 1 to the age. So we've talked about all of this. We're now finally going to look at the common mistakes we make while handling or while dealing with React State. One of the common mistakes is not using the setter function to update our data dynamically. Not using the setter function, just like we said, always make sure you use the setter function to update the data of your state dynamically. Again, use default values to avoid undefined. What do we mean by default value? This is the default value of our state. And when we created the initial state, we said const age, set age, and we say the initial value is 10. Always use initial value to avoid undefined. And finally, we say keep state updates efficient. Don't store unnecessary data. Only store data that are necessary. Keep your state decent and efficient. And guys, that's everything you need to know about React State and the React State setter, right? So you know how to manage component state, you know how to update properly and avoid common mistakes people make in handling React State. So the next thing to do is to try modifying the state with objects, experiment with functional updates, and of course, drop your comment where you faced any challenge. I'll come back to this video and address every of your complaints. In our next video, we're going to talk about event handling. We talked about event handling here. We have the onClick. In our next video, we're going to expand that. We're going to expand event handling in our next video. If this video is helpful, please guys, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notification so you don't miss when we upload the next video. See you guys in the next video. Bye for now.